Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Global Trade Live, the free webinar series from the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Executive Editor at the Chartered Institute, and it's great to see so many of you joining today's session. If you are new to the Chartered Institute, just by way of introduction, we are the foremost association for importers, exporters, and supply chain professionals, with a mission to empower global trade by equipping businesses and individuals with the expertise needed to trade compliantly, sustainably, and profitably. Let's begin today's Global Trade Live, though, by introducing our speakers and talking through the running order. So on the next slide, you'll see that today's session is looking at what direction the EU is going to take when it comes to trade policy and customs regulation. And we've got a great panel of experts, including from both the Chartered Institute and beyond. Beginning with the Chartered Institute, I'm delighted to welcome Ilona Kofka to Global Trade Live for the first time this year. Ilona is the lead of the Institute's Imports Advisory Practice and has been navigating the complexities of global trade for almost a decade, representing the Chartered Institute on key UK government initiatives, such as the Border Target Operating Model and the 2025 UK Border Strategy. We will be beginning the session by doing a fireside chat with Ilona, where we'll be aiming to rattle through some of the key EU changes that are coming up from CBAM to de minimis. After that, we'll be running a panel discussion looking at the broader direction of EU trade policy, particularly given the current volatility in global trade. Our public affairs lead, Grace Thompson, will be joining me for that discussion. Grace has significant public affairs experience, having advised a range of MPs in the UK and through various projects with the Chartered Institute over the last 3 years, including the E-commerce Trade Commission and the Women in Trade Hub UK. She also previously advised at Edelman Global Advisory. On the next slide, you'll see we're also being joined for the panel discussion by Kate Foster from the Federation for Small Businesses, well, FSB, and Gordon White from CT Strategies. Kate is Deputy Head of International Affairs at the FSB, a major UK membership organisation for SMEs and the self-employed. She works with the UK government, EU institutions, and the WTO to tackle barriers to international trade, and is also a board member of SME United, the Europe-wide association for SMEs. Gordon White is Executive Director of European Operations at CT Strategies, and today brings extensive experience in customs law, administration, and logistics. He has worked in the trade policy world with various governmental and multilateral organisations, such as the World Customs Organisation, the UK Department for International Development, the IMF, and the European Commission, and he's also held senior positions at the International Air Transport Association and the International Road Transport Association, among many others. After the panel, I will also spend a couple of moments previewing what's coming up next in our Global Trade Live webinar program this year. We'll hope to answer a few of your questions too. And we'll also be playing a video at the end to mark National Apprenticeships Week, showing how apprenticeships can help firms get the skills needed to navigate some of the regulatory changes we will be covering in today's webinar. For now, though, I'd like to go to you, our audience, with a poll. So we're here looking to gauge what awareness you have of the EU Customs Reform Programme, and this should have appeared as a pop-up on your Teams window or in the Teams chat. Options ranging from very aware and knowledgeable to never heard of it. While you are answering that poll, the usual housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me and the team with your comments or questions throughout the webinar. You can just type these into the chat. Please note we cannot guarantee we will get to every comment or question in the allocated time, which is about an hour today. Indeed, please do keep your questions as relevant as you can, as we won't be going into overly company or sector-specific questions today. So my advice is to keep it high level, so that other people on the line would be as interested in the answer as you are. Secondly, a recording of today's webinar will be posted onto the Insights section of our website, expert.org.uk, by the end of the week. Do get in touch if you have any issues accessing this. But for now, let's have a look at the poll results. I think I need to respond to the poll first in order to see the results. I'm going to say I've heard of it and have some awareness. And I am not alone in that regard. Just over half of you, or half of us, 51% of the audience has said the same, that you've heard of it and then you have a bit of awareness. Just 2% of you would describe yourselves as very knowledgeable. So that's quite a minority. 35% of you have heard of it, not sure what it is. 12% never heard of it at all. So quite a mix on the audience, but I think it's fair to say we all are here to learn a little bit more about the EU Customs Reform Programme. So thank you everyone for responding to that poll. At this point, though, I'd like to welcome Ilona Kovka, the Import Advisory Practice Lead at the Chartered Institute, to the webinar stage. A big welcome to Global Trade Live, Ilona. Now, Ilona.
Hi, well, thank you for having me today.
It's great to have you. Now, Ilona, we're aiming to do a quick fire jargon buster in which you're going to quickly define some of the various rules and procedures that the EU is introducing in the coming years. And a warning to the audience, this will include a fair few acronyms because this is international trade after all. However, given we just ran a poll on it, let's begin with the overarching programme, which is the EU Customs Reform Programme. Ilona, what actually is this?
So EU customs reform is a package of proposed changes and reforms that were kind of first presented in May 2023. And it came from an intensive and extensive review of the situation in EU and the EU customs borders. And then in July 2025, that moved towards a kind of negotiation and came up as a customs reform proposal 2028. So this is an approach from like a EU customs reform at creating a significantly more connected, data-driven environment for traders, but not just for traders, but also for increasing the compliance across the EU, across the member states, and also increasing the visibility over the movements of goods and actually what comes into the EU market. So there are few core elements of the reform, including setting up the EU Customs Data Hub, that will be a portal that centralizes the data, and anybody importing goods into the EU will be able to log information, their product and supply chain into the EU Customs Data Hub. There is also a plan of creating a EU Customs Authority from March 2028, and this will have various roles, but the main role will be overseeing the EU Customs Data Hub. And it's, I think, currently under discussion where this customs authority should be sitting member state-wise. There is a plan for enhancements for customs simplification, so such as trusted trader or trust and check. So decreasing the amount of checks required for the traders that are deemed trusted. And there is also the elimination of the 150 euros duty and VAT threshold on low value consignments. So this has been identified as a loophole that allowed undervaluation of the goods coming into the EU, so like small parcels, for example. And this is paired also with the duty calculation and low value product simplification, so the valuation of those goods. So that will kind of streamline the compliance for businesses and making sure that despite this threshold being removed, there are some simplifications in place.
Thank you, Lorna. I think we'll come back to that threshold as well later on. But let's go through some other specific changes now. So a major topic we've covered a few times in recent years has been CBAM, our first acronym. Can you remind the audience what that is and where in the timeline of implementation we are at the moment?
So the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which stands for CBAM, is quite important topic, and it's still very intensively developing, and there are different things changing about CBAM, and even for us customs experts, it's sometimes challenging to follow up on all the changes that are happening because it's very dynamic. So I think what's the most important is that on 1st of January, the CBAM entered the compliance phase. So the transitional period that has been in place since 2023 has ended now. And CBAM as a mechanism is a big part of the EU climate policy that prevents the carbon leakage. And important is that are bringing over 50 tons or more of like CBAM covered products. They will have to, well, that's per year, of course. They will have to declare the embedded emissions of the imports following September. So from September 2027, the companies need to surrender their certificates for their imports for 2026 and 2027. And this is a simplification that was brought by Omnibus package, and probably we'll touch upon it a little bit later. It's also worth mentioning that the EU Commission introduced a package of 8 implementing acts and 2 legislative proposals back in December 2025. So this is a quite important change that was quite recent. And I encourage everybody to get familiarized with those suggestions and those legislation that was implemented because it touches upon topics like benchmark alignment with the EU ETS. It looks at the upward adjustment default values, at the calculation of CBAM certificate prices, and like the logic behind it for 2026 and 2027, which is going to be a little bit dynamic yet again. So those topics, like I mentioned, can change. And even if it's like today, this is accurate, and mid 2026 or in 2027 can be really different. So it's really important to pay attention to those changes and regulations that are coming in through 2026, 2027, and even 2028.
Thank you, Ilona. It seems really important just staying on top of all of this stuff all the time. So that's useful information. In a similar vein and another acronym, we often talk about EUDR. What is that?
So EUDR stands for EU Deforestation Regulation, and it bans the import of products that come from the regions affected by deforestation. And there is a cutover deadline of December 2020. So the products are, for example, cocoa, coffee, soy, beef, timber, palm oil, rubber. And this list is not exhaustive as well because this is something that's subject to further expansion in the future. And the producers will have to log in data on those products that has a geolocation where those products were sourced from. So it's quite I think challenging from the implementation perspective regulation. However, on the 4th of December 2025, the EU Parliament and Council agreed on a proposal to postpone the EU Deforestation Regulation, and that then entered into law, I think, on 17th and was accepted by the 23rd. So EU Deforestation Regulation is further postponed by a year for now, I believe, and based on also those proposed provisional agreements, there will be a review of EU deforestation regulations and what should fall into the scope. So from now on, the EUDR should maybe apply from 30 December 2026 for large and medium operators and traders, and micro and small operators, that's 30th of June 2027 for now. And this provisional agreement that I mentioned also kind of looks at the responsibility for submitting a due diligence statement for the goods. So this is going to limit the requirement to just the operators placing product on the market, and note the downstream operators or traders would have to submit it according to the previous expectations. So the EU Commission will be looking at making a review of the EUDR regulation, how it impacts the traders and how it impacts everybody around regarding administrative burden of those regulations. So we expect this report in April 2026, probably. So this is something that we should be looking forward as well.
Now, you mentioned earlier the omnibus package. Could you just say a little bit more about that quickly as well, please?
Yes, so omnibus package, or actually packages, this is something that European Commission introduced as a process of simplifying existing EU regulation, as they are looking to reduce the burden on the businesses and also to boost the EU competitiveness on the market at the same time. So they're looking at cutting administrative costs so across the board, not just on the sustainability aspects, by 25% for companies and 35% for SMEs. And that was the goal of the omnibus packages. However, this project is looking at simplifying and not deregulating. So they are not planning to remove the regulations that were planned to be implemented. They are trying to simplify the process for the traders so it's not so burdensome when it comes to admin. So there were up to this day, there were different packages that have been introduced, and they affected CBAM regulation, they affected EUDR, they affected changes to European sustainability reporting standards, sustainable finance disclosure regulation. It affected also sustainable batteries directive and the battery regulation from 2023. So there's a chemical omnibus, defense omnibus in place. I highly recommend everybody to have a look at all those omnibus packages that have been introduced throughout the last year.
Thank you. And also, I think in the sustainability space, but I think broader, digital product passports is another thing you've spoken about on one of our webinars before. Can you just remind people what those are, DPP?
Digital Product Passport is my favorite topic at this point. And Digital Product Passport is essentially a digital record or a digital twin of a product that will be holding information about the product, about the components, about the materials used in the creation of the product, and about the end-to-end supply chain data as well. The sourcing of the raw materials, manufacturing process, distribution, and also how to process the end of life recycling of the product. So, how the information will be stored on the digital product passport will depend on the product type. And this regulation, or actually the digital product passport concept, is introduced through Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulation called ESPR, which is like a key pillar for EU sustainability strategy, making sure that the products put in the EU market are durable, reusable, repairable, energy efficient, and also that they are aimed at the circular economy, so they're possible to recycle. As the EU, throughout the whole policy around the sustainability, looks at minimizing the environmental impact of the products that are being made available in the EU market. So there are different products covered under the Digital Product Passport regulation, and they are regulated under the delegated acts, which are being issued for all the products that are being covered under Digital Product Passport. I think what's important to mention is that the Digital Product Passport affect the goods that are heavy when it comes to sustainability effects. So this will affect, for example, ICT goods and electronics, batteries, which are coming quite soon, textiles, automotive components, plastic packaging, furniture, construction materials, industrial machineries, everything that can be recycled and should be recycled, and the level probably now is quite low. So the European Commission working plan for 2025-2027 has planned issuing some of those delegated acts in a specific manner, and they will be implementing the requirement. What's important is that if your goods are in the scope of falling under the Digital Product Passport requirements, ESPR requirements, once those delegated acts are in place, you'll have 12 to 18 months to implement the Digital Product Passport for your goods as a manufacturer. So it's really important to be aware of those and follow the development, as this can be seen as a barrier to market entry for the EU once Digital Product Passport is implemented.
Thank you. Thank you, Lorna. I know you did a presentation to our members recently for our manufacturing SIG on just those delegated acts as well. So it seems a really important area. I'm going to ask one last question for this part of the webinar, and we'll come back to some of the other to one. But you mentioned the low value consignment threshold earlier. It's often called de minimis as well. Could you just say about a bit more about what the changes are here and the significance, I guess, particularly for the e-commerce sector?
So this is a very important change because it's affecting us quite soon. I think in December, it has been agreed that there is a reform coming in for the customs treatment of e-commerce parcels. And from the 1st of July 2026, all the goods entering EU will, with the value of 150 euros or less, will be subject to a flat customs duty of 3 euros per item. And this is quite important. And there is another measure which announces 2 euros handling fee per consignment as well to be introduced in November 2026. This is introduced due to the fact that EU is quite overloaded with a lot of e-commerce traffic from a low value consignments, and this may kind of impact how these are being handled. I think what's important to mention here is also the fact that this is just an interim measure till there's the bridge of the gap of the full reform that I just mentioned before, the 150 threshold removal around the launch of the customs data hub. So it's a temporary measure, and then we have the full removal of those. Now we just have to pay this five euros kind of costs, additional costs. Um, and this is quite significant because a lot of other countries are following similar approach right now, for example, US. So
Thank you. And we are going to be doing an entire webinar on de minimis later this month for our members as well. So thank you, Ilona. I do have one more question for you, but at this point, I want to go to the audience initially with another poll here just to kind of gauge how prepared you feel for the various changes that Ilona has mentioned so far from CBAM to de minimis. That poll should be appearing in your Teams window or in the chat shortly. Yeah, there we go. Options ranging from very prepared to not at all prepared or not sure. As you answer that poll, Ilona, my final question for you is, obviously we've gone through a lot of EU changes just now, and there's more which we could go through if we had more time. For example, Made in Europe or PFAS is one as well. But how can listeners stay on top of all of these changes, and how can they get support to prepare for them?
I think it's a really important question because we are bombarded by a lot of news and a lot of information that's relevant kind of gets to run away. I think it's important to follow what we are publishing because we do cover most of those topics and we've been covering them since last year, especially on the EU customs reform. And reading and also paying attention to when those news have been issued because something that has been valid in February 2025 is not valid by today if you find it in Google. Not to depend on AI and ChatGPT to find information about those things as well. Reading up-to-date information, looking for the newsletters that have current updates, because all those topics, like I mentioned, are quite dynamic. And because of those all facilitation efforts while trying to maintain competitiveness in the market from the EU side affect either removal of those requirements to a degree or reduction of the requirements, but also kind of staying up to date because there's more information, more clarity happening in the different documents, different delegated acts, different regulations and proposals to legislation. So I think signing up to all the newsletters that give you all those updates is really essential. And attending events like this one.
Of course. And thank you, Alon. I mean, it's really interesting seeing the poll response. So 40% of people say they're quite prepared, 0% very prepared. So that means it's a pretty big proportion, even not very or not at all prepared, about 46 when combined with 14% not sure. So there's a real, I mean, I suppose, how can you ever be very prepared for changes which are still coming in and which are still live and fluid? But certainly plenty of people saying they're not so prepared. So hopefully this quick fire jargon buster has been useful, and we do go into all of these topics in more detail in our lunchtime learning webinars for members and in the newsletter. Great, Ilona mentioned. But Ilona, I'll let you go for now because we're going to start moving on to our panel discussion, covering what all these changes may indicate about the EU's wider strategy on trade and whether this strategy is itself subject to change given the increasing volatility in the wider world, which I'm sure you've all been following. So a big welcome to our panelists, who once again are Grace Thompson, Public Affairs Lead at the Chartered Institute, Kate Foster, Deputy Head of International Affairs at the FSB, and Gordon White, Executive Director for European Operations at CD Strategies. If I may begin with yourself, Ilona has outlined a range of changes that the EU is currently making to trade across its borders. Why is there so much change taking place, and is this unusual?
Thanks, Will. I hope attendees will bear with my slightly dodgy voice. I was in the middle of a stream in the Peak District over the weekend, which is what I suspect has contributed to this. But anyway, on to the changes that were being mentioned. There certainly is a lot of change. And I think probably all the attendees on this call and my fellow panelists will agree that change is now a constant in international trade. It certainly feels like that has increased over the past few years, although you could argue it has always been the case. But to zoom out a bit, I'd say there's two key reasons why there feels like a lot of change at the moment, particularly on the EU front. One is that some of the changes are a byproduct of longer term thinking going on within European Union and political structures. And the second is change due to flexible reactions to geopolitical changes over the past few years. So just to briefly touch on both of these. Longer term, obviously, as Ilona mentioned, the EU customs reform programme has been in discussion since 2023, if not before. And if we think back to September 2024, which actually feels like a long time ago now for many of us, I think, we had the publication of the Draghi report on EU competitiveness, which led to the omnibus packages that Ilona was mentioning earlier. And that report was basically commissioned because there was a recognition that new levers for growth were necessary within European economies. And the report based, various facts as it gathered opinions from stakeholders that Europe must confront fundamental choices about pursuing decarbonisation paths whilst also preserving the competitive position of industry. As part of that, they acknowledged that the EU's ambitions on their decarbonisation goals, including CBAM, of course, which was introduced in 1st February this year, mean that there are additional short-term costs for European industry. And the other interesting thing, of course, about the report was this acknowledgement that Europe is vulnerable to coercion of other actors, particularly because of a wide range of external dependencies, and the use of these dependencies basically as a geopolitical weapon, which we've started to see playing out in various ways over the past year or so. And I think that's where the shorter term comes into play as well. Certainly on measures like the removal of de minimis provision for low value consignments, we're seeing this in part as a reaction to movements from the US administration who changed their regime last August, and also cheap goods flowing into European markets. And it's not easy for a bloc of 27 member states to act nimbly, but I think that now this is what they're trying to do in some ways to respond to changing geopolitical shifts in the short term.
Thank you, guys. Have that glass of water, much well deserved. Again, zooming out, so Grace has obviously mentioned some of the longer term changes, but also the shorter term implications of particularly the Trump administration, but the broader weaponization of trade. Gordon, the EU customs reform program does predate the latest Trump presidency at the very least. What is the significance of that program in the long term, and where is the EU at in delivering it, and is that being affected by the current geopolitics?
Will, sorry, I missed the first part. You cut out the first part of your introduction. Could you repeat, please?
So just zooming out a little bit. So obviously Grace talked about why there's so much change going on in the EU, but the EU customs reform program is a longer project. Could you just say a bit about what progress the EU has made in delivering it and why it's such a significant program?
Well, I think really to start with, it's probably worth mentioning it's the biggest change in EU customs systems and programs for about 50 years or so. And the main driver is the explosion in e-commerce. I say that's the main reason behind it. And the traditional customs procedures that have been in place for many, many years are no longer fit for purpose. So adjustments have to be made, and we've discussed some of them on the call. Grace and Ilona have mentioned some of the key components. There has to be a whole new approach. In terms of how it's progressing, it's a bit stop and start. Sometimes it rapidly increases, particularly around things like the removal of the de minimis. That's progressed quite quickly. And in fact, there's a couple of member states that are actually introducing, for example, the customs fee way ahead of the deadline. Romania is one of them. But one of the fundamental changes that will have to take place is obviously the centralization of the systems into the data hub. And that, we know from experience, can often take a long time for EU member states to actually transition and move to a new system. And that's normally caused through things like funding, political will, change of government, and so on. So some parts will accelerate, other parts will take a long time to actually introduce. For example, the data hub, whereby no matter where you're established and where you're bringing your goods into the EU, you can actually submit your declaration through the data hub, will not be fully up and running until 2037. but the removal of the de minimis really starts from July 2026. So in answer to your question, Will, some things will come quickly, others will take some time to actually be introduced, and that also includes things like the single customs authority that will take a bit longer.
It was ever vast. I mean, it's 27 countries. It's going to be slightly complicated. Obviously, we've got Kate here as well from the FSB, and you deal with supporting UK SMEs to kind of navigate some of these changes. I mean, what is the sort of UK business sentiment towards these kind of big changes which are happening in the EU over a period of time, and how are companies preparing for these, noting that 34% of people weren't very prepared and 12% not at all prepared for these changes?
Thanks. Well, yeah, I think those statistics are interesting, and they chime with some of the findings that we have as well from speaking to FSB members. I think there's a short answer in terms of the impact of some of these changes, and that is that change, particularly this amount of change, even when some of it is ostensibly aiming at simplification and streamlining, change comes with a time and financial cost, particularly for small businesses who, I don't need to tell you, have fewer resources, fewer time, less manpower on top of everything else. And quickly taking a step back and looking at the broader environment that businesses are operating in, our quarterly confidence survey of FSB members shows declining confidence. In fact, Q3 2025 was only the second time that the percentage of small businesses that were bracing for some kind of contraction in their business in the next 12 months significantly outweighed the percentage expecting to grow in the same period. So 30% of businesses were telling us they expected to shrink in some way, 18% expecting to grow. There's a number of factors at play there, whether that's the tax burden, increased business rates, growing labour costs with the Employment Rights Bill coming in. All of these are contributing to, I would say, a certain nervousness and anxiety among business owners. And my takeaway from that is that a lot of businesses are focusing on survival, frankly, particularly the smallest businesses. So then when you look at the particular impact of these customs reforms, which is, it'll depend, according to which particular legislative instrument you're talking about. So, for example, getting rid of the low value threshold, the customs threshold for low value imports. By doing that, you are bringing small firms or any business sending low value imports, but it does tend to be small firms, into the customs system with all that entails. So the paperwork, the paying of the duties, going through the process of understanding what your customs value is, what your HS code is, getting the right valuation, on top of actually paying the duties themselves. Plus, you've got the EU bringing in a flat handling fee, which is going to have a disproportionate impact on small businesses because they have tighter margins, they're less able to absorb a flat fee into their costs, or less willing or able to pass that on to the consumers. And there are easements such as, a lower fee for warehousing in the EU. Those easements aren't necessarily that easily available to SMEs because, again, it costs time and money to get something like that set up. And then when you're looking at some of the supply chain due diligence regulations, and, of which EU deforestation is one, that is introducing new reporting requirements with the aim of increasing sustainability and transparency. And even if those reporting requirements aren't directly applied to small businesses because they're focused on the tier 1 suppliers, we are anticipating at least a trickle-down impact of larger businesses requiring the businesses in their supply chain to also provide reporting information. So there's a lot of admin and cost coming the way of small businesses. And you asked about preparing to navigate those rules. Speaking from past experience over the last few years, as various changes associated with leaving the EU have come in, for many, not all small businesses, obviously, but for many, it's a case of dealing with it when it comes. Some businesses will be able to put processes in place. Some businesses will be able to, think more long term about it. But we know from speaking to businesses over the last few years that quite often the uncertainty of when things are coming in, the uncertainty of how to navigate it, of not being able to get hold of guidance in time, means that it's something that might get left to the last minute or until the changes have come in. So, it's really useful to have webinars like this, to have support and guidance available to businesses, to avoid ending up in a situation where you're suddenly having to understand abrupt changes in rules. I think the thing that I'm concerned about really is that, unfortunately, the cumulative impact of a lot of these changes, and again, from experience speaking to members, that some businesses have ultimately, reluctantly, opted to stop trading with the EU. And it's not because small businesses don't want to comply with these rules, it's that it's very difficult in terms of the cost and money. So I'm not trying to be doom and gloom about it, but I just think it's really important to be aware that there are a lot of changes coming the way of business. So, having guidance, having support is a really, really crucial part of the process to make sure that businesses aren't blindsided.
And yeah, I mean, just to come back on that as well, I mean, I guess Kate and Grace, you're both involved in liaising with government on behalf of businesses, small and large, in the case of Grace as well, in terms of making sure that the government knows that these disruptions are painful. And I mean, the UK government is looking at resetting EU relationships to some extent. And Grace, I just wonder if you want to come in on that at all, just in terms of helping businesses through this, kind of what role does government have to play, but also the institute and organisations like FSB?
I'm so sorry, Will. I also didn't get the first part of what you said there.
So, yeah, guys, I mean, just coming in on what Kate was just saying, small businesses have to deal with a lot of change, a lot of new admin. Could you say a bit about, the role the organisations like the Institute can play to help businesses feel heard, but also the ongoing UK EU reset in terms of what opportunities there might be there for reducing some of this admin?
Yeah, thank you, Will. Yeah, it's a huge priority for us to pass business feedback onto government. It's exactly why we exist. It's why my role exists, to be that messenger between business and government, and to try and provide solutions based on that feedback as well. And I just want to say at this point, my door is always open to anyone who wants to pass on their challenges or equally opportunities where they see that there are opportunities for whether that's new markets or new solutions to international trade challenges. So I'm sure we can put my email address in the chat for that. In terms of the wider UK-EU relationship, I think when we look back at the influence of what some of the US's recent actions have had across the globe, the EU is quite an interesting one to look at in terms of their reaction. I think that they've actually become a lot more flexible in terms of some of the areas where their red lines might have been previously. I think there's been a lot that's been positive done between the UK and the EU in recent times. So, for example, last year having the UK-EU summit and the agreement that there would be an SPS agreement, and obviously there's a legislative process now by which there'll be a bill where we can start nailing out what that SPS agreement will look like. If we think, somewhat more widely about some of the changes we've discussed, when Valdis Dombrovskis, I always get that name wrong, Commissioner for Economy and Productivity, came over to the UK the other week and had meetings with the Chancellor and others. He spoke about Brussels now being open-minded about closer trade ties with the UK and including on customs union talks. Now, Prime Minister Starmer has been very clear that closer ties with the EU single market are preferable to customs union. But we have, seen a lot of progress on the UK side as well in terms of really working together, having more of these kind of meetings between representatives, both in the UK and over in the EU, to try and maintain some of these closer ties. Because as Kate pointed out earlier on, we've seen that huge drop off in businesses trading with the EU, and particularly with the unpredictability on the global stage. We need as many opportunities open as possible. So yeah, it's interesting to see that the EU is being a little bit more flexible in some areas than it might have been maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
Thank you, Grace. Now, just to kind of wrap up this part of the webinar, I want to move on to discussing how all of these EU changes fit into the broader dynamics of global trade. Suffice to say, a lot has happened, as people have alluded to, over the last year that may affect the EU's own policies, whether that's Trump's tariff threats, including over Greenland, or the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Grace, to begin with yourself, and then I'll open this out to the wider panel. A lot of the changes mentioned so far, including the customs reform program, do predate Trump's most recent return to the White House. But to what extent has the Trump presidency changed the nature of the content of EU reforms? And I guess just more broadly, how much is the EU having to realign its strategy because of the other actors in global trade, whether that's the US, China, Russia, and so on?
Thanks, Will. I'm actually going to start off with a quote I read just before this webinar, actually, because some people may have seen that President Macron was making a speech today, and he talks about the importance of Europe reasserting itself as a power on the world stage. And I'll just quote what he said briefly, because I think it's relevant to the question you asked. He said, "The US, which we thought would guarantee our security forever, is no longer sure. Russia was to give us cheap energy forever, but that stopped 3 years ago. China has become a rival that gets fiercer and fiercer." And so obviously now, as you said, there's the new US administration, not so new now, and there's a need to react to that in a way differently than before. And I think that different allies are looking to different places in terms of trade relationships, and also in terms of military relationships, which is what we've seen actually in terms of things like the Coalition of the Willing the other year. I think we're going to definitely see a lot more friendshoring in the future. This is where there's intentionally more manufacturing and sourcing from countries that are geopolitical allies. And I think as well, some of this harks back to the short-term, long-term framework that I mentioned at the start of this webinar. Excuse me, sorry. We've been looking recently at the EU-India deal, and that is a deal that has been discussed for, I think, around 20 years. But some of the relationships with the US and the complications of that have led to things speeding up quite significantly. And this also ties in with India's refusal to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a grouping led by China, bringing together 15 Asia-Pacific countries. So there's a lesson here, I think, for us in terms of remembering that geopolitical shifts can often look like they happen in one sort of big bang motion, but actually they're a result of gradual changes over time. And so whether these are kind of long-term relationships or short-term relationships, the trade policy has to react to these things as they go along. And I think that what we have to do from the UK perspective, and what I think Prime Minister Starmer was saying a couple of weeks ago, is how do we, help businesses to navigate and make use of as many markets as possible and reduce our dependencies and vulnerabilities in supply chains across many actors.
Just to bring in Gordon or Kate, Gordon initially, I mean, how do you see it in terms of the EU's future direction and how it relates to other parties?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift I've seen, and I actually live in Brussels, so I'm quite close to, what's going on here, is a gradual move to protectionism, really. And I think a lot of the measures that we're seeing being put in place today forms part of that, particularly things like the de minimis. There's a realization here as well that there's a need to be more self-sufficient, and that's not only within trade, but that's obviously within things like defense, because the old reliabilities that we had on the US and some other trading partners, you can't count on those anymore. So you need, as Grace says, that degree of agility and ability to, change and pivot to new requirements, new demands, new markets, and so on. There's a level of cautiousness as well. And I'll give an example of that. Within the European Union, they've actually got measures prepared to combat the tariffs coming out of the US, which they would levy on US goods, but they've held back from actually putting them in place, mainly because of the reliance on things like defense support from the US. So it's really a mixed bag there, but the general consensus is we need to be self-sufficient, we need to be more inward looking. But there are exceptions, and one of the exceptions is the UK. There has been a softening within Brussels and within member states towards the UK. We had an announcement made by the Prime Minister of Spain recently, I think it was last week, where he said that the UK would be welcome back. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but certainly things like maybe joining the customs union, it's likely that there would be an open door policy in Brussels to welcome the UK into that sort of version, if you want. Now, if that occurs, of course, that a lot of the issues that we're talking about today with things like the de minimis and new requirements, electronic requirements, data requirements, obviously they would disappear over time and make trade a lot more easy. So that's my reflection on that particular topic, Will.
Thank you, Gordon. And just to bring Kate in as well, I mean, from a UK perspective, it seems that there's maybe an opportunity for the UK government to get closer to the EU because of these geopolitical shifts. But assuming that's something which small businesses, from what you're saying, we're crying out for, Kate.
Well, I think the big thing to remember here is that global trade tends to thrive on predictability. We haven't had very much predictability particularly over the last year, but even before that. I definitely agree with Grace and Gordon that some of these policy changes that the EU has been putting together are the work of several years. We've been trending in this direction for a while, but we've only recently been starting to use the word protectionism as a description of where some of these policies are going, which I think is interesting. I think my reflection from a business perspective is that perhaps businesses need to stop seeing the current global geopolitical instability, particularly centered on what the US is doing in terms of trade and the effect that has. It's not an aberration. It's not a hold on tight for 4 years and then we'll go back to normal. I think we need to start approaching this as a new norm when we're planning in terms of making your business investment decisions or your pricing, how you structure that into the cost of doing business.
Thank you, Kay. That echoes a lot of what we've heard on other webinars recently and at conferences as well. It's new norm is often bandied around as a phrase, but I think it does really apply in this context. So thank you all three of you for your insights just now. We'll put a couple of audience questions to the panel shortly, but before we do, I do just want to give everyone an overview of what's coming up later this year on Global Trade Live. That being the new name for our free webinar program. And we will be running our Global Trade Live webinars on the second Tuesday of each month, so nice and easy to remember. And as has been alluded to in this webinar, there's plenty going on in global trade for us to cover. So we'll be doing topics such as the ongoing reset of the UK-EU relationship in May. We'll be checking in on the global tariff war in general in the summer, and we'll be going to export controls and sanctions in the autumn. Before all of that, our next Global Trade Live webinar is on the second Tuesday of March, which is the 10th, and that is going to be looking at the UK's free trade agreements from India to South Korea to CPTPP. We're really looking forward to welcoming back Grace for that one, as well as David Johnston, the head of the FTA utilisation of the Department for Business and Trade, and Glenn Marriott from the exporting company Village Bakery, who will be using the UK's FTAs. Then in April, again on the second Tuesday, this time the 14th, we'll be looking at what you need to know if you're preparing for a customs audit. You can scan the QR code on screen to book your free place on either of those webinars. And members of the Chartered Institute will also be delighted, I'm sure, to hear that your exclusive programme of the lunchtime learning webinars is returning later this month, with the next session looking at de minimis changes in the US, EU, and UK. We touched on EU de minimis a lot today, but this member exclusive session will go into further depth on what the changes entail and how businesses need to navigate them. Then in March, the lunchtime learning program will be going into further detail on CBAM changes in both the EU and UK, again giving more detailed compliance advice. Lunchtime learnings take place on the fourth Thursday of every month at 12 p.m. So de minimis is going to be on February 26th and CBAM on March 26th. Members can book places on these webinars via the same QR code, and the link we'll be sharing in the chat in a moment. But let's get back to today's webinar. We have a few moments to ask some of your questions on the EU's direction on trade and customs, as well as maybe a couple of specific questions as well. Delighted to welcome back, of course, Grace, Kate, and Gordon, as well as Ilona, I hope as well, for this part of the webinar. Ilona, if you're there, I'll come back to you initially, just because we did have to end your section slightly early, and there's a load of changes which we probably didn't get to. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say, is there any other really pertinent EU trade or customs changes which haven't come up so far in this webinar, which people should know about?
Showing up today a little bit. I think there are quite a lot of changes coming in this year and upcoming year, and even staying in sustainability area. There are different regulations affecting different types of traders. So, for example, in July, large traders in the EU will be prohibited from destroying unsold apparel and footwear under the ESPR regulation they've mentioned. There is the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Regulation, actually directive. And from September, you will not be able to use terms such as eco-friendly, green, carbon neutral without having having those statements recognized by informed data, so environmental data gathered through companies that are allowed to gather this information. So you will not be able just to use those words freely on your packaging. There is, for example, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. That's also, it's effective since 2024. Into it because it's quite influential. And there is Right to Repair Directive, which is coming soon, and it's affecting goods and manufacturers who will have to provide a specific information on how to repair the goods, how to replace them, how to access spare parts, and provide the reasonable repair conditions after the legal guarantee period is expired. So sustainability is full on in 2026, and we have to look for those changes.
Thank you, Ilona. There's a few more webinars in coming up, I think, for yourself and colleagues. Just going through a few questions in the chat from the audience. So Joanna asks, can you circulate the slides? We don't tend to circulate the slides anymore, so we don't have presentation content in them these days, Joanna, but we'll circulate the recording to the webinar, and that'll also be available on the website. Gemma asked, will you be discussing FTA? So I think the FTAs were alluded to a little bit in the webinar already today in terms of the EU's deal with India. We are doing a session on the UK's free trade agreements next month, so do sign up to that one if you're more interested in FTAs. Had a question from Donna about where can we find information about the CBAM regulation changes released in December. I believe Ilona's posted in the chat in response to that, so hopefully that's useful, Donna. I've had a couple of questions from Laura on DPP. I'm going to ask the second one because it looks a bit more general for the wider audience. So, Ilona, Laura has asked, will DPP be required for transit packaging as a product?
So digital product passport is related to product, and in an ideal world, the digital product passport of a product is placed on a product. So not even on the packaging. It has to be put directly on the product. And the digital product passport products, there are plastics there is aluminium in scope as well. So it's really dependent on the type of packaging, and we have to wait for those directives to come in and delegated acts to come in and tell us how the scope is covered and in what form. I think there was a regulation mentioned, the EPR and PPWR, which are affecting the packaging quite heavily. And I feel like we should do another webinar on those regulations as well, because I hear questions about the packaging quite a lot. This is a separate regulation, and it's kind of not related to digital product passport at the shape and form that I have seen it for now. But we can know more once we have the delegated acts.
Thank you, Ilona. We just got a question in from Elvina. I'm afraid, Elvina, it's a very specific question. We don't tend to get into commodity code specific questions. We can send you some links to our technical helpline or to our advisory services if you want further information on that particular question. What I am keen to do, we've got about a minute left of this part of the webinar. So I was just wondering, Gordon and Kate, your guests on the webinar, I just wondered if either of you have any sort of final reflections or suggestions for our audience who might be a bit anxious about the level of change going on. What are your sort of reflections would you share of our audience just to kind of wrap things up today? Begin with Gordon.
Okay, I think you're actually doing a lot already from what I can hear. It's the first time I've been on one of your webinars, but obviously you're posting a lot of material on your own website. In terms of all the changes taking place and being able to track them, I think Ilona mentioned that it's important to see what's going on the Commission's website. Now, they don't only post the legislation on the EU Commission's website, but they also post one-pager guides, they post Q&A sections and so on. So a lot of those can actually help companies who are trying to adjust to the new requirements by actually just going to that and reading that. They normally develop some training material as well, so it's worth having a look at that. They're all additional sources that companies can go to see what's happening and what's changing.
Thank you, Gordon. And Kate, any final reflections from yourself?
I think just to echo what Gordon and Ilona have said, it's so important to stay up to date, but to make sure that you're staying up to date via the official sources of information, via the European Commission. That's going to be the best place to find out what the EU is doing. Because as Ilona mentioned, everything is happening so quickly that if you're doing a quick Google and looking at something that came out a year ago, it's not necessarily up to date. So the official sources are the best.
And Grace, very quickly, you just messaged me. I just want to say something as well, just to wrap up.
I was just going to say as well, it's very positive that through the trade strategy that was published last year, there has been a forum set up called the EU Files Forum, which is a two-way dialogue between UK government and businesses, looking at changes which are going to come in from the EU and helping businesses to prepare. Because sometimes it's the case that a change comes in and you're thrown into chaos because you didn't know it was coming. So that is something that has helped businesses to prepare adequately. And the final thing I'd just say, probably on behalf of some of our good colleagues in DBT, is go look at the Business Growth Service as well. There's a lot of information on there as well about support in selling to the EU.
Thank you. Some really useful signposting to finish off. So thank you everyone in the audience for your responses to today's polls and for your questions. A huge thank you as well to our experts today in Ilona, Grace, Kate and Gordon. I think we've done pretty well in delving into what is quite a vast amount of change taking place in the EU regarding trade, while also giving some of the context about the broader dynamics taking place around this. So thank you for sharing your insights with myself and the wider audience today. As mentioned at the start, we're going to finish this webinar in a slightly different way to normal because it's National Apprenticeships Week this week. We're going to be sharing a link in the chat to the page on our website where you can find examples of how our International Freight Forwarding Apprenticeship has helped organisations build the next generation of freight and customs talent. Freight forwarding apprenticeships are an undervalued means for which businesses can develop their team, making use of government funding to upskill in freight, customs and shipping. A video with one of our business members, Fluke Precision Measurements Limited, will be played in a moment's time, in which their trade compliance and security manager, Peter Crading, explains why an international freight forwarding apprenticeship was an excellent investment. So we'll shortly have that. We'll also have an exit poll as well, where you can let us know what you thought of today's webinar. I won't reappear after the webinar, so a goodbye from me. But for now, over to Himo to play the video. think, are we having the video? Live tech, we're getting there, I think. There you go, it'll be with you shortly.
To enroll Ed on.
Okay.
I think let's share the link, I think, in the follow-up
Confidence
email.
increase enormously. It's really helped him within his role within the organisation.
I chose to become an international freight.
An international freight forwarding specialist apprenticeship is a good investment. The team benefit enormously by sharing their experiences. IOEX Limited has been so helpful. Nothing has been too much trouble. They have taken us through the process regarding the apprenticeships. Collaboration with the IOEX Limited has been superb. We decided to enroll Ed on the International Freight Forwarding Apprenticeship to give him a good foundation. I've seen his confidence increase enormously. It's really helped him within his role within the organisation.
I chose to become an international freight forwarding specialist apprentice. I'm completing the International Freight Forwarding Level 3 course with IOEX Limited. I started off with a skills assessment so that my tutor could gather where I'm at, what they need to focus on. I also got shown how to operate and navigate the website, all the resources that I need, and who I can go to contact for different things.
The things I found most useful in my apprenticeship with IOEX Limited are having access to a tutor. The courses are really well paced, you get enough time to do everything. The assessments have been really good.
The freight pathway that I'm doing is road. Road freight forwarding is particularly relevant for my job role, so it's good to kind of get an insight of how that all works, how that can affect us, how that can affect my team. It'll also be good to be able to share the knowledge within my team to help us with our day-to-day activities, and also deepen my knowledge on the subject.
I'd highly recommend apprenticeship with IOEX Limited. It's been really good for career development and personal growth.